Recording. Aaron, as I'm sure you all know, and I think he needs little introduction, is a fellow and assistant director of the Knapp Foundation, and so my closest colleague as the director of the foundation, and also a research associate at Royal Holloway, University of London, where he did his PhD. His primary research interest is the relationship between the philosophy of history and the history of philosophy from antiquity to modernity. And he is the editor of a number of edited collections, including Heidegger and Classical Thought, published by SUNY Press in 2024, The Essence of History, published by Routledge this year, and with me he has co-edited Heidegger and Parmenides, which will come out with Bloomsbury in 2026. And he is currently working on his monograph, Thucydides and the Ground of History. And I will make a personal point, which is one of the greatest pleasures for me is to see a powerful scholar beginning to reach into his stride. And as I've worked with Aaron in the last few years, it's been my privilege to watch him gaining, or you, Aaron, gaining in confidence. And so I'm sure that we're in for something quite remarkable this evening. And on that basis, I will hand over to you, Aaron, and say we're all looking forward to this very much.
No pressure whatsoever. Thank you very much. That was very generous. I'm just gonna, if I can, share screen. And then is the PowerPoint visible?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Lawrence. Chances are, if you've had even the most minor encounter with the Knapp Foundation, you've heard us talk about ground, the question of ground. Some poor soul may have dialed a wrong number, got us, and hung up half an hour later wondering why we kept talking about ground. To be sure, the question of ground has not always been crystal clear to us. This question was one Lawrence and I would discuss on a weekly basis in 2021, sat around his kitchen table, deliberating on how to begin to shape the foundation, what it is and who we are. We never used the word then, but the question of ground had taken hold of us, even if we didn't know it yet. This evening then, I want to expand on precisely this question of ground, of not what it is, because it is not a what, but a how. How is it with ground? And I want to do so in terms of the research stream that we run on history and historical thought, and more specifically in the context of my work on Thucydides. Thucydides was, of course, an ancient Greek historian belonging to the 5th century BCE who wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War. The extent to which he was a historian and the extent to which he wrote a history may well be queried on the basis that nowhere in the history is the word history used, neither in its nominal or its verbal sense, history or historien. Naturally, this point could be considered pedantic, as if the word poetry or poem was never used in the poetical corpus of John Keats. We still wouldn't hesitate to call Keats a poet. We should nevertheless be concerned, though, with how Thucydides and the way he does history is judged in modernity according to the modern conception or conceptions of history that we have. While Thucydides has long been considered one of the greatest historians to have ever lived, and since the 19th century is that historian who pioneered the method of scientific historiography that became so determinative for the development of modern historical theory, he has only ever been judged according to these later developments. A mere pioneer he remains. Today, nobody takes Thucydides seriously as a historian anymore. In modern historical discourse, if he is remarked upon at all, it is only to express how far we've come since Thucydides, how far we've progressed. This has become obvious to us, so much so that we don't even question this obviousness, because it's obvious. If then we are to make the question of ground clearer, we might begin by inquiring into this, the obviousness of the obvious. Let us turn to Thucydides. Just to be clear, this is the original Greek, the transliteration, and then my translation. I don't normally use slides, but I wanted what Thucydides has to say to be crystal clear. In the introductory passages of his history, Thucydides remarks that so little do most human beings suffer in their inquiry into truth, turning instead to what is most readily to hand. This, to my mind, is the foundational problem of Thucydides' history. Contextually, this problem is twofold. In one sense, it is a criticism of Thucydides' contemporaries and their limited understanding of even the most recent past events, thus requiring a more precise historical method. In another sense, it lays the groundwork for Thucydides' interpretation of the Peloponnesian War and his critique of human decision-making, particularly that of the Athenians throughout the history. Thus, the basic principle underlying Thucydides' historical method is at the same time the very subject of his historical inquiry. What did Thucydides write his history for? He tells us those wishing to see clearly what happened and will happen again in the future in the same or in a similar way, according to anthroponion, will judge this to be sufficiently useful. It is composed as a possession for all time rather than as an opus to be heard in the moment. As you can see, I've left to anthroponion untranslated as it is, I think, untranslatable in any concise way. Traditional renderings like the human condition, human nature, and the human thing are too laden with modern terminological baggage. It means something like the being of how it is to be human. So how is it then, according to Thucydides, for human beings to be human? As he says, so little do most human beings suffer in their inquiry into truth, turning instead to what is most readily to hand. Thus, Thucydides' history is an inquiry into anthroponion itself, characterized in terms of this fundamental problem of human knowledge. We might yet ask, in what way did Thucydides mean for his history as a possession for all time to be useful? Ordinarily, this is understood in terms of the purpose that we commonly assume history serves, which is to provide a lesson for our own time. If only we could locate the specific cause of one historical event, we could feasibly understand others or even predict future events if such common causes were discerned. As the saying goes, if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat history. Thus, Thucydides is often labelled as the father of scientific historiography, in light of his efforts to establish a firm foundation for historical method, and, as I said earlier, has long been considered a pioneer of this discipline. And yet, again, a mere pioneer he remains. Since at least the 19th century, Thucydides has been interpreted as an important precursor to modern historical and historiographical developments, and it is according to these developments that the historical and historiographical merits of his history have been measured. As such, Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War has been read by historians only insofar as we find in it a preparation for modern historiographical method, and only insofar as it appears to anticipate features of modern historical thought. If Thucydides is taken seriously by historians today at all, any interpretation already takes for granted that whatever he has to say about history merely anticipates the emergence of modern historical method. As such, Thucydides is always reinterpreted as an epistemologist and, unsurprisingly, not a very good one. Thucydides was a groundbreaking historian in his own time, but he has long since been surpassed. This is, of course, obvious to us all. What must be done then to liberate Thucydides from these modern trappings? Must we try to isolate the real or the original Thucydides from the intellectual and theoretical baggage of modern historical discourses, as if we could simply bypass 2.5 millennia of progress in order to discern what Thucydides really meant? No, of course not. Perhaps then we could try and locate passages of universal substance within the history, as if by remarking on their universality we can bring Thucydides back to relevance in the modern age. This has certainly been attempted in the field of political theory in the last few decades, whereby Thucydides and his history have been ploughed for universal statements on human nature, on international relations, and on power dynamics between individuals and the state. But for what? In what ways will such readings contribute to clarifying or even resolving these issues in the modern world beyond merely reminding ourselves that such issues are themselves historical and extend back to antiquity? Does that make Thucydides and the ancient Greek world relevant again? I would say the same in the field of modern historical thought. So my broader aim with this project is not to suggest to modern historians and philosophers of history that Thucydides might hold some answers for any of the particular problems currently besetting them, as if he might solve or resolve some issue concerning narrativism or common cause theory or such. My aim is to neither liberate Thucydides from modern historical thought, nor simply to make him relevant again to its modern discourses, but rather to ground modern historical thought and its discourses in Thucydides himself, and the fundamental question of truth that grounds his history. In doing so, I suggest the question of ground will itself become clear. Let us return then to Thucydides' foundational statement that so little do human beings suffer in their inquiry into truth, turning instead to what is most readily to hand. The question of truth and the way of a genuine inquiry into truth did not emerge for Thucydides arbitrarily, but was the fundamental question of his day. From the so-called pre-Socratics, particularly Parmenides and Heraclitus, through the rise of the Sophists, and to the metaphysical philosophies of Plato and Aristotle, this question became the foundational concern of Greek philosophy. This same question of truth, of what truth is, and the possibility of our knowledge of truth, emerged as the defining question of modern philosophy, beginning with Descartes in the 17th century, but owing its impulses to the innate Aristotelianism of medieval scholasticism. In many ways, the development of the question of truth at the heart of European metaphysical philosophy, especially in terms of the influence of mathematics and the natural sciences, became determinative for the advancement of historical thought and new conceptualizations of historiographical method. In turn, modern interpretations of Thucydides became grounded in these methodological and epistemological frameworks, according to which he was distinguished as the pioneer that we established earlier. How Thucydides grounded his history in the fundamental question of human knowledge and the way of an inquiry into truth has only ever been considered in light of these developments. This was especially the case in Germany in the late 18th and early 19th century, when history as a discipline became formalized and professionalized, and when the question of historical method was delineated, and according to the advances of not only mathematics and the natural sciences, but rationalism itself. The confrontation between historicism and positivism in the middle of the 19th century largely decided the trajectory of historical thought that historical thought would take, and we are still today caught in the aftermath of this debate. In whichever ways this trajectory proceeds, interpretations of Thucydides follow suit, and so his history is only ever interpreted, even by classical historians, on the basis of where the trend of historical thought currently stands. So little do human beings suffer in their inquiry into truth, turning instead to what is most readily to hand. This statement has such universal applicability that you'd probably find it in the dictionary next to the word Twitter or Reddit or any social media platform, really. This statement is fundamentally historical. In Thucydides, it speaks to a crisis of truth that in many ways came to define the classical period of ancient Greece. In its simplest, perhaps most abstract form, this crisis of truth is a manifestation in Greek thought of an oppositional distinction between, on the one hand, aletheia, what we might translate as truth, and on the other hand, doxa, seeming or opinion, that grounded the question of the fundamental question of truth for the Greeks from the 6th century BCE onwards. It is no coincidence that this crisis of truth emerged at the same time as the spread of democracy across the Greek world. As I said earlier, it was according to this crisis of truth that Greek philosophy developed in the way that it did, from Heraclitus and Parmenides through the Sophists and toward Plato and Aristotle. Thucydides must be placed squarely in this tradition, but the way in which Thucydides addressed the crisis of truth has never, in my view, been adequately grasped. Why? Here is the crux of my paper and the crux of the question of the ground of history more broadly. If, in the unfolding of historical thought from antiquity to modernity, thinking itself remains bound to this fundamental question of human knowledge, that concern for a genuine inquiry into truth, which in its unfolding obscures that which came before it by reinterpreting it according to its own progress, then it is only through inquiring into the nature of this unfolding itself that the possibility for an inquiry into the essential ground of human knowledge emerges. So how does the historical thought unfold in modernity, which allows for this obfuscation of Thucydides' historical engagement with the question of human knowledge? We begin where modern philosophy traditionally begins, with Descartes. While Descartes himself never produced anything close to a comprehensive critique of historical knowledge, the skeptical character of his philosophy was hugely influential in the development of historical thought and historiographical method in the 17th and 18th centuries. In his 1637 treatise Discourse on the Method, he suggests that one who is too curious about the practices of past ages usually remains quite ignorant about those of the present, even the most accurate histories, while not altering or exaggerating the importance of matters to make them more worthy of being read, at any rate almost always omit the baser and lesser notable events. As a result, the other events appear in a false light, and those who regulate their conduct by examples drawn from these works are liable to fall into the excesses of the knights errant in our tales of chivalry and conceive plans beyond their powers. End quote. For Descartes, the real issue is not the question of how the past itself is retrievable and could be adequately represented, but the extent to which the criteria of selecting information of the past, information about the past, is arbitrary. What degree of certainty could the historian achieve in portraying a past event free from bias? Far from being discouraged, French historical thinkers rose to the challenge of Descartes' skepticism and the consequent concerns of historical Pyrrhonism, such as authorial bias, reliability of source material, and the criteria for historical judgment were addressed comprehensively throughout the 18th century. In doing so, classical historians, particularly Roman historians, were the subject of both Pyrrhonist and anti-Pyrrhonist debate, and it was on the basis of this critique of ancient historiography that the pillars of a more reliable and truthful modern historiography could be constructed. What should be immediately apparent from this grossly oversimplified account is the philosophical drive towards certainty underlying the basic condition of truth in human knowledge. Why does modern philosophy traditionally begin with Descartes? Precisely because of this concern with certainty and the possibility of establishing a mathematical method through which the intellect itself can undertake mathematical thought and provide knowledge of essence itself. Such is the ambition of Descartes' rules for the direction of the mind, which he began writing in 1619, and where his rationale is remarkably similar to the statement of Thucydides, and we can't help but hear Parmenides here too. Descartes writes, "Mortals are so held by curiosity that they often let their minds wander along unknown paths, without any ground for hope, just being willing to suffer danger wherever that which they are seeking may be hidden. And while I do not deny that they may sometimes wander so felicitously that they discover some truth, nevertheless I do not concede that they are on that account any more diligent, but only more fortunate. It is much more satisfactory never to think of searching for the truth about anything than to make the search without method, for it is absolutely certain that by disorderly studies of this sort and by obscure meditations, the natural light is confused and our minds are blinded, and whoever thus becomes accustomed to wander in the dark so weakens the power of his eyes that later he cannot bear the full light of day." Evidently, the solution for Descartes was the establishment of method, by which he understands in terms of certain and easy rules, which, if followed properly and diligently, shall never mistake, he says, anything false for true. And so by gradually increasing one's knowledge, the human being will arrive at a true knowledge of all those things of which he shall be capable. Descartes' insistence on the necessity of method for establishing any truth arose out of his time at La Flèche as a student, where he said he especially liked mathematics because of the certainty and the self-evidence of its reasoning, and so arithmetic and geometry are pure from all vice of error and uncertainty. If then philosophy is to become, that was the end of that quote, if then philosophy is to become an absolute science for Descartes, it must conform to the structure of modern science itself. Nothing, he says, can be known prior to the intellect itself, since knowledge of all things depends upon this, and not the other way around. Thus Descartes holds that human knowledge proceeds first and foremost through the pure cognition of the intellect, wherein the possibility of the distinction between truth and falsity exclusively resides. In this way, the ground of human knowledge is the intellect itself, that becomes the method upon which the res cogitans, the thinking thing, thinks, and so becomes the arbiter of certainty, of deciding between truth and falsity. I've dwelt on Descartes here precisely because of his preeminent position at the beginning of modern philosophy. Broadly speaking, philosophy unfolds in modernity from out of Cartesian skepticism and its ground in the subjectivity of human knowledge. through Leibniz, who was undoubtedly more influenced by Hobbes and Spinoza, but who nevertheless could not ignore Descartes, and then through Wolff, Baumgarten, and Kant, the question of the relation of the mathematical method and the intellect, and the possibility of human knowledge of universal truth was developed. It was against this strand of rationalism, particularly that of Wolff and Baumgarten, but also Fichte, that German historicism grounded its own epistemological approach to historical inquiry. Through initially Herder and then later Ranke and Droysen, all of whom were heavily influenced by Kant's concept of intuition, German historicism sought to establish a method of historiographical inquiry based on an intuition of particulars through which knowledge of how it really was, of how events of the past really happened, could be ascertained and known with certainty. Contrary to the basic principle of historicism, positivism emerged in the 1830s, primarily through Auguste Comte, and maintained that such knowledge of particulars must reveal universal truths in the form of general laws. The debate between historicism and positivism and the role of epistemology for the establishment of method for both dominated the 19th century, and it was against the scientific and philosophical character of these debates that the credibility of ancient historiography, particularly Thucydides, was measured. Thucydides contributed very little to these debates and inevitably fell into obscurity, where in the discourses of the philosophy of history he remains today. Despite the necessary brevity and unavoidable oversimplification of this unfolding of both historical and philosophical thought, I hope I have at least hinted toward the problem underlying the modern interpretation of Thucydides, which stems from out of both the advancement of natural sciences and mathematics demanding a more exact and systematic methodology, and in consequence what we might call, or as Martin Heidegger would certainly call it, the subjectification of the human subject in the inherent capacity of human knowledge to know truth as such. What then am I proposing? To reiterate, the problem, I think, is that by placing Thucydides at the time of the commencement of this developmental process, we only ever read Thucydides in light of these later developments of this process and judge him and his history according to its progress. Thucydides poses the question of human knowledge in terms of to anthropon, as the question of history. The way the same question is taken up in modernity and in historical thought then determines how we interpret the way in which Thucydides posed the question. And yet we cannot simply bypass this process to find what Thucydides really meant, precisely because our reading of Thucydides is rooted in the context of this process. The task, then, the historical task, is to inquire into this rootedness itself, to inquire into its ground. It might well be asked, why Thucydides? What special relevance does Thucydides hold that any other Greek thinker, the likes of Parmenides, Heraclitus, Plato, and Aristotle, who of course, like Thucydides himself, have been reinterpreted according to the later development of the philosophical tradition? My suggestion is that while these thinkers engage with the question of truth philosophically, perhaps abstractly, Thucydides confronts the crisis of truth of his time as a genuine historical problem. Thucydides, in posing the question of truth, is not so much interested in attending to the epistemological basis upon which knowledge of being rests, that of reason and logic, the relation between subject and object, the priority of essence and existence, and the possibility of rendering true statements about things. For sure, producing an accurate historiographical account of the Peloponnesian War is important for Thucydides, but the ground upon which this account stands, the ground of truth itself, is the utmost concern. For Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War is the historical manifestation of the crisis of truth, through which the character of to anthropon, of the being of human being, emerges and reveals itself. If to anthropon is characterized in terms of this statement, then it is the truth of this statement that besets Thucydides, not by means of a direct engagement with the philosophical distinction between aletheia and doxa, between truth and seeming, towards some kind of resolution, as if some particular configuration of the faculty of judgment and reason could be located and put to work in determining the truth, but as an inquiry into the ground of what makes possible something like this distinction in the first place in its unfolding. Where then modern philosophy aims at resolving the first half of Thucydides' statement, that of a genuine inquiry into truth, out of which in many ways our modern interpretation of Thucydides' history springs. It is the question of what roots the statement, that of the historical human being itself, that is foremost for Thucydides. If Thucydides speaks to us at all today, he does so not in terms of the universality of this statement, as if we might despair at the prospect that 2,500 years later this statement is as true today as it was in classical Greece. Rather, it is because we remain rooted in the unfolding of the same ground out of which Thucydides and Greek thought emerged, and through which the crisis of truth that became determinative for Western thought manifested itself. For Thucydides, truth is not merely some truth to be discovered, as that of the relation between mind and thing, between subject and object, in order to make some accurate statement about a past event. Rather, a genuine inquiry into truth, as a thesis tes aletheus, means resolving yourself to the truth that befalls you, that places a demand upon you. Throughout the history of the Peloponnesian War, and especially in terms of the Athenians and their actions throughout the war, the character of Tanthroponion constantly reveals itself as Athenian decision-making deteriorates, and willfully blinding themselves to the truth of their situation, resolved to invade Sicily in 415, which spelt inevitable disaster for them. According to Thucydides, the Athenians should have easily won the Peloponnesian War, and would have done so if they'd followed Pericles' advice. That they didn't, and that they lost the war, is what drives Thucydides to inquire into the ground of history itself, an inquiry into to anthroponion, that essential character of the human being, of the being of human being. To bring this to a conclusion, then, I've gone over. The question of ground that underpins the Knapp Foundation, that which is meant when we say on our website that we open paths for inquiries into truth, and I put motto here because I couldn't think of a better word, and I'm sure Lawrence is rolling his eyes right now. This is what we mean when we talk about ground. To pose the question of ground is to inquire into the truth of the unfolding of truth itself, in order to discern not this or that particular truth, nor even some universal truth, but the truth of, in Thucydides' terms, to anthroponion, the truth of who we are. Thank you.
Aaron, thank you very much indeed. That was a fantastic opening for our own inquiry today. Thank you. I'm going to invite people who have questions, please, to indicate by, I think the best thing to do is if you use the hand raising thing. But as there are no hands up just yet, one of the questions that we've pondered enormously is the question of presence. And I wondered if you could just comment on how you see that question of presence working in the working out of how the anthropos understands him or herself.
Yeah, I mean, it's no secret that reading Heidegger, as I have done for the last 7 years, and speaking with you, so the things I've learned from you and Heidegger would be to characterize truth as the happening of the presencing of the present, I suppose, if you were to do that in Heidegger's terms. So I suppose truth and its relation to the anthropos then is precisely the presencing of the demand that is being placed upon you. The situation that you find yourself in, that you must respond to, that you must resolve yourself to. And that's why in their history, the Athenians at the beginning of the war, they go to war for good reason, because they know, according to Pericles, and Thucydides substantiates it retrospectively, but he does, by saying that they would easily win the war against the Spartans, but they don't, which drives Thucydides to ask the basic question of history itself, which is to inquire into the historical character of human being and how they respond to that demand being placed upon them. Why did the Athenians decide in 415 to invade Sicily when it was absolutely against the advice Pericles gave? Because they ignored the good advice that they were being given, and they followed the bad advice because it was precisely what they turned their minds to. So the situation, the decision they had to make was based on the present demand being placed upon them. And so that's where I would, characterize that understanding of the presencing of the present.
Thank you. Thank you. John.
Well, thank you very much, Aaron, for the talk. And I have had all sorts of things that I wanted to say. I mean, in passing, I suppose I worry about this close link being made between human beings and truth, since truth is, or arguably truth is independent and entirely independent of human beings. There would be lots of truths, even if there weren't any humans. But the two things I had especially in mind to ask as the talk was going on, well, one, I suppose I take issue with you following the, I mean, yes, I agree, normal historiography and talking about Descartes as the beginning of modern philosophy. And I think, in a way, seeing things like that get so many things wrong that it's very hard. I think it's very hard if you start from that view, although a lot of people take it. The other thing I wanted to ask about was ground, and just how does your use of ground relate to the common use of ground among analytic philosophers? Where, I mean, I had the idea that talking about grounding was very fashionable, though in fact they tell me it's now only historians of philosophy who think that it's fashionable. They've gone on to something else. But so their meaning of ground as a sort of relationship of priority, but one which is not causal. So there are those three things. And I think it's too much for you to deal with and won't leave time for other people to ask their questions, but they're things we could discuss at another stage. But if there's any bit of that you'd like to answer.
Yeah, of course. I mean, just, on the last bit, I suppose the way I take ground is to, when we consider the development of the history of philosophy, we normally do it in terms of how ideas are passed down from antiquity to modernity, but between thinkers as well. So, Descartes follows scholasticism to some extent, even though he's also following other thinkers, people like Galileo as well. And then you get people like Spinoza, Hobbes, who are, and there's this kind of developmental process going along where you draw Kant back to Hume, and then you draw everybody seemingly after Kant back to Kant, and then Hegel, and then Neo-Kantianism. There's this kind of narrative almost of how ideas are passed between thinker and thinker. And so I suppose to engage with the question of ground is to ask how that development really unfolds, precisely because in each case, what went before it is seemingly then it's considered prior, it's considered more primitive than, so the point with Thucydides is that he doesn't quite live up to what modern, there are many quotes by people like Friedrich Kreutzer and Ranco who say Thucydides could not measure up to the modern scientific understanding of history. And so he's consigned to that, he tried his best, but, if only he knew what we know now, if only he had the development of the techniques that we have now. But so to question the ground then is to question the ground of those assumptions, to question why and in what ways Thucydides is primitive compared to these modern developments. Because in modern philosophy of history, Thucydides simply isn't discussed anymore. He's a footnote in many histories of philosophies of history, because he stands at the beginning of the tradition, not at the end of it.
Yeah. But I mean, just briefly, I suppose you although in a way you're questioning, and your idea of ground is to question the way in which people talk about development, but you seem to adopt a lot of that language. I mean, partly in talking about development, and you seem to have some idea that philosophy has in some way developed, which seems to be most strange, because philosophy obviously hasn't developed. And you might be, given the way in which you want us to think about Thucydides, and you might well be sympathetic to that, but you seem to be sort of throwing yourself into or interpreting the context in which you discuss things in a way which is rather against the case that you want to make, and against your feelings about how one should understand somebody like Thucydides.
Interesting. I mean, perhaps I'm struggling to escape then from the language of development, because it's precisely that question of development that I'm suggesting isn't happening. It's almost like I'm saying
Yes.
there's been no real progress in
Yeah.
historical thought since Thucydides, and to think there has been the mistake.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
it might just be a case of analyzing the language I suppose I'm using is and trying to avoid suggesting a developmental process going on. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Frank, I was really hoping you were going to come in.
Okay, I want to follow up on your presence, Lawrence. It seems to me, Aaron, that you're introducing the question of hermeneutics into Thucydides. Is that right?
In what way?
It seems to me that, well, I first started out with the question of presence, but then I went to time. And I thought, how does Thucydides treat time? How does he engage time in that notion of the collapse of, or the blindness of the Athenians? And it seems to me that, I'm sorry, I'm not a Thucydides scholar, but it seems to me that that process involves a process of hermeneutics. And so how does Thucydides engage that collapse or that blindness as a process in time?
I mean, the way I would read time here is the way that Heidegger would read time in Parmenides, is precisely again in terms of presencing of that
Yeah,
which is coming toward you.
right.
And so there is obviously a historical time going on in Thucydides because things take place over a period of years where he observes this gradual deterioration of Athenian decision making, which ends in this disastrous decision to invade Sicily, which essentially completely disrupts the end of the war for them. I suppose I'm struggling then to understand where the notion of hermeneutics is coming in and what
Well,
might be the issue there.
it looks like the Athenians did a really big misinterpretation here. I guess that's where I'm coming from in terms of hermeneutics and the notion of time, interpretation, the process of interpretation through time. I don't know.
I mean, and it's precisely that series of decision making, I suppose, which is what Thucydides, how and where he draws out his idea of tyranthropon, of the being of human being. If that's a hermeneutical process, then I don't, I don't know. I suppose it must be, but it's hard to then pin that idea onto Thucydides.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, as I said, I'm not a Thucydides scholar. Thank you.
I mean, just on that, I was going through the word noein, or trying to work out what was going on with the word noein today. And I came across a discussion in the literature of how noein is the presencing of time in Parmenides in a way that's never discussed, because Parmenides doesn't do us the favor. He's not read any Aristotle, so he doesn't do us the favor of calling it time. But to think from to is to think. All thinking is a dianoein, a going across from to, as it were, but also a dividing up. The dia also points to diairesis, the dividing up of the unity of the presence that is there into its understandability. And who should turn up as one of the biggest users of the word dianoein but your mate Thucydides? I mean, dianoein does appear as early as Alcaeus, I discovered. But Thucydides uses it not once or twice, but dozens of times. And it strikes me, therefore, that there is something incredibly important going on there in relation to what Frank asks about the question of time, because the where I have seen philosophers struggle historically, and I'm using it in both senses, is in trying to relate time to history. I mean, I've several times written myself on why history isn't about the past. I mean, my chapter in your book on the essence of history was exactly on why history isn't about the past. But I wonder if, does that help us here, Aaron?
Well, I think so, especially in terms of, if you bring Parmenides in, and Heidegger says the word for being in, the other word there instead of noein is moira as well, the lot that you're given, and so Heidegger says of Parmenides, the word of being, or the word for being in Parmenides is moira, much like the word for being in Heraclitus is logos, in Anaximander telkreion, in Plato idea, and in Aristotle energeia. And why? Because in each case, those indicate a certain understanding of time which is pressing upon you, not some process of time, which is how we understand history traditionally, because it's a process of historical events. And I suppose that relates then back to John's first question about truth and where we locate truth, because truth is in some philosophical traditions exterior to the human being. It's out there somewhere. That was Plato's point, right? That it's epikanon, it's beyond. Plato places aletheia beyond the confines of being itself, as the agathon, as the good toward which, and which I suppose draws us to it as to understand truth. But truth for Parmenides and truth, I think, for Thucydides is precisely that which is simply confronting you at every turn. It's the truth of the situation you find yourself in. And so truth in that sense is time, because it's time that's pressing upon you. Time is pressing the truth of your situation upon you, and toward which you must resolve yourself. Either, you could turn towards most readily at hand, the way of doxo, if we go by the three ways of Parmenides, or traverse the first way, the way of aletheia, which is to resolve yourself to the truth of what is, I suppose, of the situation you're in, of the demand that is being placed upon you.
Aaron, thank you.
Does that mean then that truth is what is pressing upon you in the present?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, always in the present. Yeah. What, in that sense, what makes the true? And it is precisely the presencing of what is presencing for you.
How does Thucydides engage alternatives in that pressing moment?
What alternative? What decisions or?
Decisions, actions. In other words,
it would be that reverse decision to abandon Pericles' plan and say, well, let's invade Sicily against all good judgment. We should do that because there's money there, and they ignore the basic truth that they're being told by one of the speakers, Nicias, who used the exact same argument that Pericles uses at the beginning in book 6 of the history. Says these are the reasons we shouldn't do this, and the Athenians ignore him. They go along with Alcibiades and they say, no, we should do this. This is a good idea. So they ignore the truth of the situation they find themselves in, and then they go along with the one they really want. They according to hope, I suppose, Elpis.
I guess I was asking that question because I was trying to figure out how the future intersects in that present. Anyway, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Well, it's just I'm aware that we are running out of time, and the assistant director sometimes gets very strict about people running over time. And I wanted to bring Nada in just at the end. Nada, if you could kindly be brief, I'd be very grateful. Thank you.
Yes, it's actually building on the question that Frank has raised. So if the time that's pressing on you is in the present, is it something from what you just said, Aaron? It goes beyond the sphere of perception. So it also gives some kind of a, through recollection, a kind of projection or anticipation of future contingents. A sea battle will happen tomorrow. That's the classic question that arises, a bit later in the tradition. So that presencing seems to be marked by a kind of interplay between recollection and anticipation in the very act of actual perception and an embodied perception.
I think that must be. I think that must be. Yeah.
Yeah.
It must be those future contingencies that you have in mind that press upon you. The plethora of potentialities that when you make a decision, when you resolve yourself to something, and the always the possibility that Thucydides stresses is that even if you plan everything perfectly, it doesn't always go of course it wouldn't always go your way. This is Polybius's point with 2K. 2K, you could make bad decisions and end up, this is Descartes' point as well, which we just saw. You could make bad decisions and end up in a good place. Alternatively, you can make good decisions based on the information you have in front of you in the present, in terms of the demand that's being placed upon you, and everything could just go awry because external factors. Or so, yeah, there's always the future in play, which I suppose is your point, Lawrence, isn't it? That history isn't about the past, but it's about the future. That the future's coming toward you. You're not coming toward it.
Yes, I mean, I'm thinking really in terms of all the discussions that Husserl and Heidegger had about presence, and the very beginning of Heidegger's time in Freiburg, where that was the issue. Where we have to close, having outed John Marrenbone as the medievalist and Thomist that he is, because I was put in mind of when John you said that there are. Even if there were no humans, there would still be truths. Aquinas says the same thing. He says, even if there was nobody left in the world, there would still be truth, except, he said, quod impossibile est. This is in the De Veritate, unless by some impossible thing God were not to exist. So there you have, as it were, the medieval structure of truth. Aaron, thank you so much for presenting. Having done one myself, I know how difficult it is to present complex ideas in a very short space of time. And you've done a wonderful job in introducing us to your research at the present time. So thank you. And thank you everybody for coming today. We have one more of these left next week with Alice Sullivan, and then we finish this series. But thank you very much indeed for another tremendous session. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.